Before we set sail into tonight's tale, don't forget to anchor yourself to nightfall notions by subscribing. The sea of stories is vast, and you wouldn't want to miss the next wave of boredom, delivered with just enough irony to make you question why you're still awake. Chapter 1. The Ill-Fated Commission. The day you signed the commission for the Ace Perpetual Agony, a name you should have taken more seriously, was the same day you learned the difference between adventure in theory and adventure in practice. The recruiter had been persuasive, a wiry man with a voice like a rusty hinge and a smile that suggested he'd already spent your share of the loot. Gold, he'd said, and glory. The words hung in the air like the smell of cheap tavern rum, and you, fool that you were, inhaled deeply. The ship itself was a creaking monument to the optimism of desperate men. Its timbers groaned like a chorus of ghosts every time the wind so much as whispered, and the sails bore patches upon patches, as if the vessel were held together by the maritime equivalent of wishful thinking. The crew was a motley assembly of the unlucky, the fugitive, and the terminally naive. You fit neatly into the third category. The captain, a man who introduced himself as Bloody Billingsley, a nickname you hoped was metaphorical, clapped you on the back with a hand like a slab of salted pork. "Welcome to the family," he said, as if you just joined a cult rather than a trading expedition. The first mate, a gaunt figure with the pallor of a man who'd been pickled in brine, handed you a mop. "You'll start with the decks," he said. "Then the bilges, then the decks again. Then, if you're very lucky, the bilges once more. You'd expected to learn the ropes. Literally. Knots, navigation, the art of swabbing with a certain piratical flair. Instead, you learned that the sea, in its infinite cruelty, had a special kind of contempt for landlubbers. Within hours of leaving port, the horizon began to wobble like a drunkard's compass. The deck swayed beneath your feet with the cheerful malice of a carnival ride operated by goblins. Your stomach, once a loyal and uncomplaining organ, staged a mutiny. The other sailors found this uproariously funny. "Seasick on the first day," cackled a man with a beard like a storm cloud. "That's a new record." Even the ship's cat, a one-eyed demon named Admiral Whiskers, looked at you with disdain before sauntering off to vomit over the railing with significantly more dignity. You'd imagined your first voyage would involve sunsets and sea shanties, not clinging to the side of the ship like a barnacle with existential dread. The AE's Perpetual Agony lived up to its name, each wave a fresh insult, each gust of wind a reminder that nature had no patience for human ambition. Below deck, the air was thick with the scent of mildew, unwashed socks, and the faint but persistent odor of despair. Your hammock, which you'd been assured was cozy, felt less like a bed and more like a sarcophagus for the clinically claustrophobic. By nightfall, you'd resigned yourself to the fact that the recruiter's promises of gold and glory were about as reliable as a compass in a thunderstorm. The only treasure you'd found so far was a half-rusted button in the bilge, and the only glory was the dubious honor of being the crew's favorite punchline. "Don't worry," said the cook, a man who seemed to regard hygiene as a personal challenge. "It gets worse." And so, as the Aegean's Perpetual Agony carved its way through the waves, you stared at the moon, cold, indifferent, and mercifully stationary, and wondered how long it would take to drown if you jumped overboard. The answer you suspected was too long. The sea, it seemed, was determined to teach you patience, one nauseating roll at a time. Somewhere in the distance, a gull screamed. It sounded like laughter. Chapter 2. The First Wave of Regret. The moment the Aene's Perpetual Agony cleared the harbor, the sea decided it had personal grievances with you. The water, which had seemed so picturesque from the docks, a shimmering expanse of possibility, now churned like a cauldron of spite. The ship lurched, and your stomach lurched with it, a revolting synchronization that made you question every life decision that had led you here. You had heard tales of sailors who never found their sea legs, doomed to spend their voyages in a state of perpetual queasiness. You had dismissed those stories as exaggerations, the kind of thing seasoned mariners told to terrify newcomers. Now, as your insides performed acrobatics worthy of a circus act, you understood the truth. The sea was not a place for men. It was a place for monsters, masochists, and those who had run out of options on land. The crew, naturally, found your suffering hilarious. "Look at him," crowed a deckhand with a voice like a rusty hinge. "Greener than the mainsail. First day and already praying to the gods below," another added, wiping tears from his eyes. Even the ship's parrot, a foul-mouthed creature with a vocabulary that would make a pirate blush, squawked what sounded suspiciously like, "Heave-ho, weakling." You would have responded with something cutting, something witty, if you hadn't been busy retching over the railing. The contents of your stomach hit the waves below with a pathetic splash, and the crew erupted into fresh laughter. The cook, a man whose idea of seasoning was whatever hasn't killed us yet, tossed you a saltine from his personal stash. "Chew slow," he advised, "or it'll come back up looking the same way it went down." The saltine did not help. By midday you had perfected the art of the seasick stagger, a lurching gait that made you look like a drunken marionette. Every step was a battle against gravity, momentum, and your own treacherous body. The ship rolled, you stumbled, the crew jeered. It was a routine as predictable as the tides. The only one who didn't mock you was the ship's carpenter, a grizzled old salt named Jeremiah who had, by his own account, seen worse. He handed you a bucket with the solemnity of a priest administering last rites. "This'll be your best friend," he said. "Treat it well." You clutched the bucket like a lifeline. It was the most meaningful relationship you'd formed so far. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that would have been beautiful if you weren't too nauseated to appreciate them, the first mate appeared beside you. He studied your face, pale, clammy, and radiating misery, and nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "Means you're still alive." You groaned. He clapped you on the back, a gesture that nearly sent you toppling overboard. "Don't worry, lad. Either it'll pass or you'll die. Either way, it's character building." You weren't sure which outcome you preferred. That night, swaying in your hammock like a corpse in a windstorm, you listened to the symphony of snores from the crew around you. The ship creaked, the waves slapped the hull, and somewhere above, a gull screamed what might have been a mocking commentary on your life choices. You closed your eyes and tried to convince yourself that things would get better. They did not. Dawn brought not relief, but a fresh onslaught of nausea. The cook's breakfast, a dubious concoction that smelled like regret and looked like something scraped off the ocean floor, did not help matters. You pushed the slop around your tin plate, wondering if starvation was a viable alternative. The crew, now fully invested in your suffering, placed bets on how long you'd last before hurling again. The current favorite was before noon. You lost the bet spectacularly by vomiting at 11:47. The day passed in a blur of humiliation and bodily rebellion. You scrubbed decks, hauled ropes, and tried, with limited success, not to disgrace yourself further. The crew's laughter never faded, but it had lost some of its edge, softened by a grudging camaraderie. Even the parrot had stopped insulting you, though that might have been because it had moved on to more interesting targets. By the time night fell again, you had begun to accept your new reality. You were a sailor, yes, but also a cautionary tale. A living, retching reminder of why sensible people stayed on land. As you lay in your hammock, listening to the ship groan around you, one thought kept circling in your mind like a shark. This was only the beginning. Chapter 3. A Sailor's Worst Enemy. The human body, you were beginning to realize, was a traitor. It had served you well enough on land, where the ground remained reliably stationary and the air didn't smell like a mix of salt and despair. But here, On the merciless swells of the open ocean, it had turned against you with the enthusiasm of a mutinous crew. Every slight tilt of the ship sent your stomach into open revolt. The gentle rocking that the seasoned sailors barely noticed might as well have been a hurricane for how your insides reacted. You had heard of men who got used to it after a few days, their bodies adjusting to the rhythm of the waves like a drunkard learning to walk straight. You, however, showed no signs of such adaptation. If anything, your condition was worsening. The crew, of course, had theories. "It's the humors," declared the ship's self-appointed surgeon, a man whose medical expertise consisted primarily of leeches and a concerning fondness for amputation. "Your bile is out of balance, needs a good bleeding." You declined. Bleeding sounded like a fantastic way to add dizziness to your already impressive list of symptoms. Others suggested remedies ranging from chewing ginger root, which tasted like dirt and hope, to standing on your head, which resulted in you nearly concussing yourself on a barrel. The cook, ever the pragmatist, handed you a flask of something that smelled like turpentine and bad decisions. "Drink it all at once," he advised. "Either it will cure you or you'll be too drunk to care." You drank it. It did not cure you. What it did do was make the horizon spin in fascinating new ways, which at least provided a temporary distraction from the nausea. The crew found this development even more entertaining than your previous suffering, especially when you tried to climb the rigging in a misguided attempt to see the world from a new angle. You were pulled down before you could plunge to your death, though not before the first mate dryly noted that hitting the deck from that height would indeed have solved your seasickness permanently. By the third day, you had resigned yourself to the fact that no remedy would save you. The sea had claimed you, not as a sailor, but as its personal plaything. Every swell was a taunt. Every gust of wind a reminder that nature found your suffering amusing. Even the ship itself seemed to be in on the joke. The creaks and groans of its timbers now sounded suspiciously like laughter. The only reprieve came at night, when exhaustion finally overpowered nausea, and you collapsed into your hammock, too tired to even dream of dry land. But mornings were a fresh hell, as your body, having briefly forgotten its betrayal, rediscovered it with renewed vigor the moment you opened your eyes. The crew, at least, had begun to treat you with a kind of grudging respect. There was honor, it seemed, in enduring relentless misery without complaint, or, at least, without complaints that anyone could hear over the sound of you retching. Even bloody Billingsley offered a nod of approval one evening as you clung to the railing, pale and shivering but still technically upright. "You're still here," he observed. "That's something." It didn't feel like something. It felt like a punishment for crimes you couldn't remember committing. Then on the fourth day the storm hit. The sky darkened like a bad omen, and the waves grew from gentle rolls to towering, frothing beasts. The ship pitched violently, and for the first time you saw actual concern on the faces of the crew. This was no ordinary squall. This was the kind of weather that sent ships to the bottom and sailors to their graves. And then the most unexpected thing happened. Your seasickness vanished. Not faded, not lessened, vanished. As if the sheer violence of the storm had shocked your treacherous body into silence. You stood on the heaving deck, drenched and freezing, and realized with something like awe that you felt fine. Better than fine, even. You felt alive. The crew, busy battling ropes and sails, didn't notice at first. But when you sprang into action without so much as a groan, hauling lines and securing barrels with the enthusiasm of a man possessed, they stared as if you'd grown a second head. The first mate squinted at you through the driving rain. "You're not puking." You grinned. Not even a little. He shook his head, as if this defiance of natural law was somehow offensive. "Figures. Calm seas make you sick, but a tempest that make the devil himself seasick doesn't faze you." You couldn't explain it. Maybe your body had finally given up. Maybe the storm had scared the nausea right out of you. Or maybe the sea had decided you'd suffered enough and was granting you a temporary reprieve. Whatever the reason, as the HEM's perpetual agony fought its way through the storm, you worked alongside the crew without hesitation, your earlier weakness forgotten. The wind howled, the waves crashed, and for the first time since setting sail, you understood why men chose this life. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. And when the storm finally passed, leaving the ship battered but afloat, you leaned against the railing, staring at the now calm waters with a mix of triumph and dread. Because you knew deep down that your truce with the sea was temporary. The moment the waves gentled, your stomach would remember its betrayal, and the war would begin anew. Chapter 4. The Captain's Dubious Remedy. True to your grim expectations, the moment the storm passed and the seas settled into a deceptive calm, your stomach resumed its mutiny with all the enthusiasm of a sailor, discovering his rum ration had been stolen. The brief, glorious reprieve was over, and you were back to clutching the railing like a man trying to bargain with God through the medium of vomiting. The crew, having momentarily respected your storm-born resilience, returned to their usual pastime of offering increasingly absurd advice. "Eat some hardtack," suggested one. "It'll soak up the sickness." You tried it. The hardtack, which had the approximate texture and flavor of ship timber, did nothing but lodge itself in your throat like a stubborn cork, leaving you both nauseous and mildly suffocated. "Bite a lemon," advised another. You bit the lemon. The lemon bit back, sending a jolt of sour agony through your jaw that briefly distracted you from your nausea, before making it worse. Then, salvation seemed to arrive in the form of Captain Bloody Billingsley himself. The man loomed over you as you hung miserably over the side, his beard bristling with what might have been sympathy or indigestion. "Still at it, eh?" he grunted. "Can't have my newest investment puking his guts out all the way to port." "Investment, That was a new one. You hadn't realized your worth had been downgraded from crew member to financial liability. The captain reached into his coat and pulled out a small, grimy bottle filled with a liquid that looked like it had been filtered through a corpse. "This'll fix you right up," he declared, thrusting it into your limp hands. "Guaranteed." You stared at the bottle. The liquid inside was a color that didn't exist in nature, a murky greenish-brown with unsettling flecks floating in it, like tiny suspended regrets. The cork was sealed with something that resembled wax but smelled suspiciously like earwax. "What's in it?" you croaked. The captain grinned, revealing teeth that could have been used to frighten small children. "Trade secret. But let's just say it's got a bit of everything. Ginger, gunpowder, a touch of rum, some herbs, a few other ingredients." "What other ingredients?" "Best not to ask." You hesitated. The bottle seemed to radiate malice. But then your stomach lurched again, and desperation overrode survival instincts. With a silent prayer to whatever God might be listening, you uncorked the bottle and took a swig. The universe exploded. Or at least, that's what it felt like. The liquid hit your tongue like a lit fuse, a conflagration of flavors so violently opposed to one another that your entire face spasmed in revolt. It was sour, bitter, salty, and sweet all at once, with an aftertaste that could only be described as dubious. Your eyes watered. Your nose burned. Your throat convulsed as if trying to reject the substance before it reached your stomach. You gagged. This is worse than the seasickness. The captain clapped you on the back hard enough to dislodge a lung. That's how you know it's working. For a moment, you were certain you were going to die. Your vision tunneled. Your ears rang. Your entire body broke into a sweat that had nothing to do with the tropical heat. Then slowly, miraculously, the world stopped spinning. Your stomach settled. Not gradually, not with hesitation, but all at once, as if whatever unholy alchemy was in that bottle had bullied your insides into submission. You took a cautious breath. Then, Another. No nausea. No dizziness. Just a strange, creeping numbness, as if your body had decided that feeling nothing was preferable to feeling everything. You blinked. I think it worked. The captain nodded sagely. Told you. Only thing better is whale oil and vinegar, but we're fresh out. You didn't want to know. For the next few hours you moved through the world in a daze. Your limbs light. Your mind pleasantly detached. The crew eyed you with a mix of amusement and concern. You look like you've been hit by a cannonball, observed the first mate. You smiled dreamily. I feel great. That's the poison talking, said the cook. Not poison, you insisted, though you couldn't be entirely sure. Whatever was in that bottle had left your mouth tasting like a dock worker's boot. But by God, you weren't seasick anymore. As the day wore on, however, the side effects began to reveal themselves. First your fingers tingled. Then your vision developed a slight shimmer, as if you were viewing the world through a thin layer of seawater. By sunset, you were convinced the ship's cat was whispering to you in Portuguese. The captain, when you wobbled up to him with these concerns, merely chuckled. Ah, that's just the herbs settling in. Perfectly normal. Normal for whom? People who drink my remedy. You were beginning to suspect that the captain's definition of normal had been forged in the depths of some maritime fever dream. That night, as you lay in your hammock, staring at the ceiling, which appeared to be breathing, you weighed your options. On one hand, the remedy had technically worked. You hadn't thrown up once since taking it. On the other hand, you were now fairly certain you could hear the ship's figurehead gossiping about you. Was this better? Worse? You weren't sure. All you knew was that when morning came, and the cook offered you breakfast, a gray, lumpy substance that might have been porridge or possibly mortar, you ate it without hesitation, and kept it down. The crew murmured in awe. The captain grinned like a man who'd just won a bet with the devil. And you, for the first time since setting sail, felt something resembling hope. Then the tingling in your fingers spread to your toes. Then your left eyelid started twitching. And then you realized, with dawning horror, that the remedy wasn't wearing off. It was getting stronger. Chapter 5. The crew's superstitious whispers. The tingling in your extremities had spread to your scalp by morning, leaving you with the unsettling sensation that invisible ants were marching in formation across your skull. Your left eyelid continued its rhythmic twitching, now synchronized with the creaking of the ship's timbers in a way that felt either poetic or deeply ominous. But the nausea, blessedly, impossibly, remained absent. The crew, however, had stopped laughing. At first you thought they were merely impressed by your sudden recovery, but as you moved about the deck, you noticed the way they edged away from you, their eyes darting sideways as if you'd sprouted a second head overnight. Conversations hushed when you approached. The usual rough camaraderie had curdled into something tense and watchful. It was the carpenter, old Jeremiah, who finally broke the silence. He cornered you near the foremast, his gnarled hands gripping your arm with surprising strength. "You ain't right," he muttered, his breath smelling of salt and cloves. "That potion the captain gave you, it ain't natural." You blinked, your twitching eyelid making the gesture more spastic than intended. "It worked, didn't it?" "Aye," he said darkly. "That's what worries me." The meaning behind his words became clear later that evening, when you overheard a whispered conversation from the shadows of the cargo hold. "Never seen a man recover so quick," hissed a voice you recognized as belonging to the ship's navigator. "One minute he's puking like a drunk whore, next he's walking straight as a preacher. That ain't right." A lower voice, thick with superstition, replied, "My granddad told stories of men who took cures like that. Said they weren't men no more after," said the sea-claimed M in other ways. A third voice chimed in, "Bad luck is what it is. First the storm, now this. Ship's got a Jonah for sure." You froze. Jonatonti. The biblical figure thrown overboard to calm a storm. The universal sailor's shorthand for an unlucky passenger who needed disposing of. Your stomach, despite the captain's remedy, did a slow roll that had nothing to do with the waves. The whispers continued. Captain ought to do something about it. Won't? You seen how he looks at the lad, like he's proud. Pride goes before a fall, and I ain't drowning for no one's pride. You backed away silently, your tingling fingers clutching at the damp wood of the bulkhead for support. The crew thought you were cursed. Or worse, that you were the curse. Paranoia settled over you like a damp cloak. Every sidelong glance became a threat. Every muttered word seemed to carry hidden meaning. Even Admiral Whiskers, the one-eyed ship's cat, took to avoiding you, hissing when you came too near as if you carried the scent of something unnatural. The next morning the atmosphere had thickened like spoiled milk. The cook accidentally gave you a portion of gruel, half the size of everyone else. The first mate assigned you to scrubbing the bilge. Alone, a task usually reserved for punishment. When you climbed back onto deck, sweat-soaked and stinking of stagnant water, the crew parted around you like you were plague-ridden. Only Bloody Billingsley seemed unaffected by the growing superstition. If anything, he appeared amused by it, watching the crew's behavior with the detached interest of a man observing ants fighting over a crumb. When you finally worked up the courage to confront him about it, he merely chuckled and took a long drag from his pipe. "Let him talk," he said, blowing smoke rings that coiled like serpents in the air. Superstitious lot, sailors. Always looking for signs and portents. You'd think men who live by the stars would have more sense. You swallowed hard. They think I'm bad luck. Luck's what you make of it. The captain's grin was all teeth. Besides, you're still standing, aren't you? That's more than most who have taken my remedy can say. The casual admission sent a chill down your spine. Most? Let's just say you're tougher than you look. He clapped you on the back, his hand lingering just a moment too long, as if checking for something. Or maybe the mix was right this time. The words hung between you, heavy with unspoken implications. How many others had there been? What had happened to them? The captain's gaze was unreadable, his eyes reflecting the flickering lantern light like chips of obsidian. That night, as you lay in your hammock, the ship's gentle rocking, once your tormentor, now felt like the only thing keeping you anchored to reality. The whispers of the crew, the captain's cryptic remarks, the lingering effects of the remedy that still made your fingers twitch and your vision blur at the edges. It all swirled together into a waking nightmare. Somewhere in the darkness, a floorboard creaked. Then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps moved through the sleeping quarters, pausing near your hammock. You held your breath, every muscle tensed. A hand brushed against the canvas near your head, and you caught the faint scent of tobacco and salt. The captain's voice, barely audible, murmured, "Still alive then. Good." The footsteps retreated. You didn't sleep the rest of the night. Dawn brought no relief, only a new horror. Scratched into the deck near the mainmast, crude but unmistakable, was a single word. Yontutukti. The crew went about their business, carefully avoiding looking at it, or at you. But the message was clear. The sea demanded balance. And if misfortune befell the ship, they knew who to blame. You stared at the carving, your stomach churning despite the remedy, and wondered how long it would be before someone decided to take matters into their own hands. The sea was patient. Sailors were not. Chapter 6. A Bond Over Buckets. The morning after the word Yuna appeared scratched into the deck, you found the cook bent over a bucket behind the galley, his face the color of spoiled milk. He retched violently, shoulders heaving, then wiped his mouth with the back of a sleeve that had seen better decades. When he noticed you watching, he didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. "You too?" you asked. He groaned and spat over the rail. "Every damn time the wind changes." This was a revelation. The cook, a man who handled rancid meat and dubious spices without flinching, who could stand in a sweltering galley while the ship pitched like a drunkard, was seasick. You almost laughed. And you handed him your handkerchief, which admittedly had seen its own share of misery. "How long have you been hiding it?" "12 years, he grunted, taking the cloth with a nod of thanks. "Give or take." "Aye." He leaned against the galley wall, his face still clammy. "You think I signed up for this life because I love the sea. I signed up because I owed money to a man with very sharp knives. Turns out, the sea don't care why you're here. It just hates you all the same." There was a kind of poetry to it, you supposed. The cook, whose very job was to sustain the crew, was as betrayed by the ocean as you were. The difference was, he'd had 12 years to perfect the art of silent suffering. You eyed the bucket still clutched in his grip. "So what's your secret?" "Secret? How do you keep going?" He shrugged. "Same way any man does. Stubbornness. Shame. The knowledge that if I stop, we all starve." He pushed off the wall and jerked his head toward the galley. "Come on, I'll show you." Inside the galley was a humid cave of bubbling pots and questionable aromas. The cook rummaged through a cabinet and pulled out a small, unmarked tin. "Ginger," he said, popping a shriveled piece into his mouth. "Doesn't fix it, but takes the edge off." He tossed the tin to you. "Try it." You chewed gingerly. The root was fibrous and pungent, burning your tongue in a way that momentarily distracted you from the sway of the ship. It wasn't pleasant, but it was better than the captain's remedy, and less likely to make you hallucinate. The cook watched you expectantly. "Well, I don't feel worse," you admitted. "That's high praise at sea." He turned back to his pots, stirring something that smelled vaguely like stew and vaguely like regret. "Here's the thing about seasickness," he said without looking up. "The crew only cares until they get used to you. Right now, you're new. Your suffering's entertainment. But give it time, and you'll just be part of the furniture." You doubted that. Furniture wasn't usually suspected of cursing voyages. Still, it was something. Over the next few days, an unspoken truce formed between you and the cook. You took over peeling potatoes when his hands shook too badly to hold a knife. He slipped you extra rations when the crew's portions mysteriously shrank in your presence. When the waves grew rough, you took turns hunched over the same bucket, passing it back and forth like a cursed sacrament. The crew noticed, of course. Sailors noticed everything. But there was a hierarchy to these things, and while they might mock a green hand, no one mocked the man who controlled their food. Your association with the cook granted you a thin veneer of protection. "You're lucky," the carpenter told you one evening as you helped him mend a broken barrel stave. "Cook's got more sway than he lets on. Crew won't cross him. Not if they want hot meals." You glanced toward the galley, where the cook was currently singing a bawdy shanty to himself while chopping what might have been onions or possibly some form of aquatic fungus. "Why is he helping me?" Jeremiah shrugged. "Maybe he sees himself in you, or maybe he just hates wasting food on a man who's just going to puke it up again." Fair enough. The arrangement worked until the day the captain's remedy fully wore off. It happened without warning. One moment, you were hauling rope under a clear sky, feeling almost human. The next, your stomach dropped like a cannonball, and the world tilted on its axis. The ginger helped, but barely. By midday you were back to clinging to the rail, your body revolting with the enthusiasm of a man who'd been given a second chance to regret his choices. The cook found you there, pale and shaking. He didn't laugh, didn't offer advice, just handed you a bucket and sat down beside you with a weary sigh. "Welcome back," he said. You groaned. He patted your shoulder, a gesture that nearly sent you toppling over. "First rule of being seasick," he said. "Never hope it's gone for good. That's when it comes back hardest." You wiped your mouth. What's the second rule? Always know where the nearest bucket is. It wasn't much, but it was solidarity. And on a ship where the crew's whispers still followed you like a bad tide, that was something. The cook stood, stretching his back with a series of pops that sounded like a rigging line snapping. "Come on," he said. "I've got a stash of peppermint oil below deck. Won't cure you, but it'll make the puking taste better." You took his offered hand and let him haul you to your feet. The ship swayed. Your stomach lurched. But for the first time since setting sail, you didn't feel entirely alone in your misery. Somewhere in the rigging, Admiral Whiskers yowled. The cook sighed. "That's the third rule, by the way." "What is?" "When even the cat's judging you, it's time to lie down." You took his advice. Chapter 7. The Phantom Land Sightings. The peppermint oil helped, but not enough. The cook's ginger root took the edge off, but barely. The captain's remedy had left your system entirely, and with it went whatever unnatural reprieve it had granted. The sea reclaimed its rightful dominion over your stomach with vicious enthusiasm, and you were back to spending your days in a fog of nausea and exhaustion. Then the island started appearing. At first, you thought it was a trick of the light, a flicker on the horizon where the haze of heat and ocean spray conspired to form shapes that almost looked like land. You blinked, and the mirage dissolved back into endless blue. But the next day, it happened again, and this time, the vision lingered. "Land ho!" you croaked, pointing at the distant smudge. The crew, who had been lounging about in various states of boredom, snapped to attention. The navigator scrambled for his spyglass. The first mate barked orders, and even bloody Billingsley emerged from his cabin with unusual haste. Then the navigator lowered his spyglass with a slow, disappointed sigh. Nothing there. You squinted. The island, no, the échappée, was still visible to you, a dark crescent against the horizon. "But it's right." The first mate grabbed you by the shoulders and turned you forcefully away. "Look again." You did. The horizon was empty. The crew dispersed with grumbles and dark looks. The word Yonah was whispered again, this time with renewed conviction. You should have let it go. But 3 days later, when another island shimmered into view, this one crowned with palm trees you could swear were swaying in the breeze, you couldn't help yourself. "There," you insisted. "Tell me you see it this time." The crew indulged you with the patience of men humoring a madman. The navigator dutifully raised his spyglass. The first mate sighed. The captain watched you with an unreadable expression. "Nothing," the navigator announced. You gripped the railing, knuckles white. "But it's right there." The cook, who had been observing silently from the galley doorway, ambled over and squinted at the horizon. "Yep," he said. "Definitely looks like land." A murmur rippled through the crew. Had you finally convinced someone? Then the cook shrugged. "Course, I once saw a mermaid riding a whale while holding a mug of ale, so my eyes ain't what they used to be." The crew erupted into laughter, tension broken. The moment passed, and the Phantom Island dissolved once more into the sea's endless joke. But the visions didn't stop. They grew more elaborate. An atoll with smoke rising from its center, perhaps a volcano, perhaps a village. A chain of rocky outcrops that formed a perfect crescent. A towering cliff face draped in vines that seemed to beckon. Each time, you were the only one who saw them. Each time, the crew's amusement curdled a little more into unease. Even the cook stopped humoring you. "You've got to stop pointing at empty water," he muttered one evening as he handed you a bowl of dubious stew. "They're already half convinced you're haunted. This isn't helping." You stirred the stew listlessly. "What if I'm Minotti, imagining it?" He gave you a look usually reserved for particularly stupid livestock. "You are. But what if—" "Listen," he interrupted, lowering his voice. "I've been on this tub for 12 years. You know how many uncharted islands I've seen. None, You know how many men go mad from thirst or fever or just plain loneliness and start seeing things. Plenty. You ain't special. You're just dehydrated and delirious? It was a reasonable explanation. A sunny explanation, Devot. But as you lay in your hammock that night, listening to the ship's groans and the crew's snores, you couldn't shake the feeling that the islands were real, or real enough at least. The next morning you didn't mention the towering spire of black rock you spotted at dawn, or the sandy shoal that appeared at midday, dotted with what looked like shipwrecks. You kept your sightings to yourself, noting them silently in the little notebook you'd started carrying, scribbling rough sketches next to the dates and times. If this was madness, you'd at least be an organized madman. Then, on the 8th day of your private cartography, the crew saw it too. "Land ho!" shouted the lookout, his voice cracking with excitement. This time, there was no mistaking it. A dark line on the horizon, solid and unmoving. The navigator confirmed it with his spyglass. The captain ordered a course correction. The crew buzzed with excitement. Fresh water, fresh food, maybe even a night on solid ground. You stood frozen at the railing, staring at the growing shape of the island. It was one of yours. The crescent chain of rocks, exactly as you'd sketched it 2 days prior. The cook sidled up beside you. "Well," he said, "that's unfortunate." We see it now," you whispered. He scratched his chin. "Problem is, according to the charts, there ain't supposed to be anything here for another 100 miles. The implications settled over you like a cold fog. Either the ship was wildly off course, unlikely given the navigator's reputation, or the island should exist. Or worse, it did exist, and you'd been seeing it before anyone else. The crew, initially jubilant, grew quiet as the island drew nearer. There were no lights, no signs of life. Just an eerie, perfect crescent of black rock rising from the sea, its center a still lagoon that reflected the sky like a dead eye. The captain ordered the ship to heave to just outside the reef. "We'll send a boat ashore at first light," he announced. Then, to your horror, he pointed at you. "You're going with them." A murmur ran through the crew. The first mate frowned. "Is that wise, Captain?" Bloody Billingsley's grin was all teeth. "If our Jonah here has been seeing this place before the rest of us, maybe he's meant to set foot on it." No one argued. No one even looked at you. As the crew dispersed to prepare for the morning, the cook pulled you aside. "Don't drink the water," he said. "Don't eat anything. And for God's sake, if you see anything else the rest of them don't, keep it to yourself this time." You nodded, your mouth dry. The island loomed in the distance, silent and waiting. You had the unsettling feeling it had been expecting you. Chapter 8. The Midnight Mutiny Plot. The night before the landing party was to set ashore, the ship lay at anchor in eerie stillness. The black crescent of the island loomed in the moonlight, its silhouette jagged against the starless sky. No waves lapped against its rocky shore. No wind stirred the skeletal palms that clung to its cliffs. The lagoon was a perfect mirror, reflecting the island's perpetual agony back at itself like some ghostly twin. You should have been asleep. But sleep had become a fickle thing these days, either impossible to grasp or so deep it felt like drowning. Tonight, it was the former. Your hammock swayed gently, but your stomach churned as if caught in a tempest. The captain's remedy had long worn off, but its absence left you raw, overly aware of every creak and whisper aboard the ship. That's when you heard it. At first you thought it was just the timbers groaning, the natural protest of a ship at rest. But then it came again, a murmur, low and deliberate, from somewhere near the cargo hold. You held your breath. The voices were too hushed to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. Conspiracy. A rhythm of back and forth punctuated by the occasional sharp whisper. Then a sound that froze your blood. The metallic scrape of a blade being drawn. Your stomach, already rebellious, clenched into a knot. On a mutiny. It had to be. The crew had been simmering with discontent for days, their superstitions fanned by your phantom islands and the captain's strange favor. And now, anchored beside an uncharted land that shouldn't exist, they were making their move. You had two choices: stay hidden and hope they didn't decide to throw their Jonah overboard in the chaos, or warn the captain and risk being gutted on the spot by mutineers. The sensible thing would have been to feign sleep. But between the nausea and the creeping dread, sensibility had long since abandoned you. You slipped from your hammock, moving with the exaggerated care of a man who wasn't entirely sure his legs would obey. The deck was deserted, the crew either asleep or gathered wherever the whispers had come from. Moonlight painted everything in cold silver, turning ropes into serpents and barrels into lurking figures. You crept toward the captain's quarters, each step a gamble against the ship's groaning timbers. Then you froze. From the shadows near the forecastle, two figures emerged, the navigator and the carpenter, their heads bent together. The navigator held something small and metallic that glinted in the dim light. A key. A knife. You couldn't tell. You pressed yourself against the mast, heart hammering. If they saw you now, you were dead. But if you didn't warn the captain, you might be dead anyway. The choice was made for you when your stomach chose that moment to lurch violently. You clapped a hand over your mouth, but the sound, a wretched wet gurgle, was enough. The navigator's head snapped up. "Who's there?" You didn't wait to find out if they'd spotted you. You bolted. Footsteps pounded behind you as you careened toward the captain's door, your vision swimming with nausea and panic. You didn't bother knocking. You threw yourself against the wood, half falling into the cabin as it gave way. Bloody Billingsley was awake, seated at his desk with a pistol in one hand and a bottle of something dark in the other. He didn't look surprised to see you. "Took you long enough," he said. You gaped. You knew. Of course I knew. He took a swig from the bottle. "Men whisper. Ships have ears, and captains," he added with a pointed look, "make sure they hear everything." The footsteps outside halted. The door creaked open further, revealing the navigator and the carpenter. But they weren't armed. They weren't even angry. They looked, if anything, sheepish. The captain sighed. "Show him." The navigator hesitated, then held out the object in his hand. Not a knife. A compass, but not like any you'd seen before. Its needle spun lazily, never settling, as if confused by some invisible force. "You've been seeing things," the captain said. "Islands that shouldn't be there. Well, so have we. Difference is, we've been trying to avoid them." The carpenter shifted uncomfortably. "Been off course for days. Compass went mad right after the storm. Then the islands started appearing. First to you, now to the rest of us. Something's wrong with this patch of sea." You stared at the spinning needle, your nausea suddenly making terrible sense. "You think the island's doing this?" The captain's smile was humorless. "I think the island wants us here. And if that's the case, sending a landing party ashore is just giving it what it wants." A cold realization settled over you. "But you're still sending us." "Aye." He leaned forward, the pistol glinting in the lamplight. "Because if something's calling this ship, I want to know who's doing the calling. And since you're the one who saw it first, you get the honor of knocking on its door." The mutiny, it seemed, had been a figment of your imagination after all. The real conspiracy was far worse. Chapter 9. The Seagull's Mocking Gaze. Dawn came too soon, pale and reluctant, as if even the sun was wary of the island. You stood at the rail with the rest of the landing party, 6 men in total, including the carpenter and a deckhand named Briggs, who smelled faintly of rancid butter. The longboat waited below, bobbing in the still water like a leaf on a pond. That's when you noticed the Seagull. It perched on the railing not 3 feet from you, its beady eyes locked onto yours with unsettling intensity. It wasn't one of the ship's usual gulls. Those were ragged, salt-bleached things that squawked and fought over scraps. This one was larger, its feathers oddly pristine, and it didn't make a sound. It just stared. You shifted uncomfortably. The bird's gaze was unnervingly human, full of what you could only describe as judgment. As if it knew exactly how much of a fraud you were. A sailor who couldn't sail, a man who puked at the slightest swell, a walking bad luck charm. Briggs noticed your distraction. "What are you looking at?" You nodded toward the gull. He followed your gaze, then frowned. "Ain't nothing there." You blinked. The bird was still there, clear as day, now tilting its head as if amused by your confusion. "Right there," you insisted. Briggs squinted, then shook his head. "You're cracked." The carpenter, overhearing, glanced at the railing. His expression darkened. "I don't see anything either." You opened your mouth to argue, but the captain's voice cut through the morning air. "Enough dawdling. Get in the boat." The Seagull, if it had ever been there at all, chose that moment to take flight, its wings silent as it circled once overhead, before vanishing toward the island. You tried to put it out of your mind as you clambered down into the longboat. The water was eerily calm, the oars cutting through it without resistance, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. The island grew larger with each stroke, its black rocks glistening with moisture that couldn't quite be called dew. Halfway there, your stomach revolted. You barely had time to lurch over the side before heaving, your breakfast joining the other mysteries in the depths below. The crew rowed on, pretending not to notice, though the carpenter muttered something under his breath that sounded like bad omens. The island loomed. Up close, it was even stranger than it had appeared from the ship. The rocks weren't just black. They were unnaturally smooth, almost glassy, as if shaped by something other than wind and wave. The lagoon at its center was perfectly still, its surface a mirror that reflected nothing, not even the boat approaching it. The longboat ground against the shore with a crunch that sounded too loud in the silence. Briggs was the first out, his boots sinking into sand that wasn't quite sand. It was finer, almost powdery, and stuck to everything like ash. You were last, your legs trembling as much from nerves as from lingering nausea. The moment your feet touched the ground, a shudder ran through you, a sensation like stepping into a room where the air was just slightly too thick. Then you saw the Seagull again, perched atop a nearby rock, watching you with that same knowing stare. This time, you didn't point it out. The carpenter shouldered his pack and checked his pistol. "Stay sharp," he said, though whether to you or himself wasn't clear. "We're here to find fresh water, maybe food, nothing else." But the island had other plans. The further inland you went, the more wrong things felt. The trees, sparse as they were, didn't sway in the breeze, because there was no breeze. Their leaves were too still, too perfect, like they'd been carved from stone and painted green. The air smelled faintly of salt and something else, something metallic that clung to the back of your throat. Briggs was the first to voice what you were all thinking. "This place ain't right." The carpenter silenced him with a look. "Keep moving." You did, though every step felt heavier than the last. The Seagull, or a seagull, you couldn't be sure, followed at a distance, flitting from perch to perch in silence. Then you found the well. It was nestled in a clearing, its stones too evenly placed to be natural. The water inside was black and still, its surface undisturbed even as you leaned over to peer into it. Briggs grinned. "Fresh water." He reached for his canteen. The carpenter grabbed his wrist. "Wait." But it was too late. The moment Briggs' fingers brushed the surface, the water rippled, not outward, but inward ache, as if something beneath had stirred. The Seagull shrieked. It was the first sound you'd heard it make, a raw scraping cry that sent a jolt down your spine. The bird took off in a flurry of wings, vanishing into the trees. Briggs yanked his hand back, his face pale. Something touched me. The carpenter didn't ask for clarification. He just backed away, pulling Briggs with him. We're leaving now. You didn't argue. The return trip was a blur of hurried steps and stolen glances over shoulders. The island seemed to press in around you, the air growing heavier with each passing minute. The longboat was where you'd left it, though the tide should have shifted it by now. You didn't breathe easy until the show at Perpetual Agony was back in sight, its familiar weathered hull a welcome sight against the empty sky. The captain was waiting at the rail as you climbed aboard. His gaze flicked from your ashen faces to the untouched canteens at your belts. No water, then? The carpenter shook his head. No, sir. Billingsley's expression didn't change. And the island? Briggs opened his mouth, but the carpenter cut him off. Best burned from memory, Captain. A long silence. Then the captain nodded. Weigh anchor. We're leaving. As the crew scrambled to obey, you leaned against the railing, your stomach churning for reasons that had nothing to do with the sea. The Seagull was back, perched just out of arm's reach, its head cocked as if waiting for your reaction. You didn't give it one. The island shrank on the horizon, its dark shape lingering long after it should have vanished from sight. And the whole time, the gull watched you, its silent judgment a weight heavier than any seasickness. You were no sailor. That much was clear. But the sea, it seemed, wasn't done with you yet. Chapter 10. The Storm That Doesn't Help. The storm struck 3 days after leaving the cursed island behind, as if the sea had been waiting for the perfect moment to remind you of its contempt. The first warning was the color of the sky, a sickly yellow-green bruise, spreading across the horizon. Then came the wind, howling through the rigging like a thing alive, tearing at sails and sanity alike. You, of course, were already vomiting when the first real wave hit. It had started as a familiar lurch in your gut, that cursed rolling sensation that no amount of ginger or willpower could suppress. You barely made it to the rail before your stomach emptied itself over the side, a pitiful offering to the gathering tempest. The crew, usually quick to mock, ignored you entirely, too busy battening hatches and securing lines to care about one seasick fool. Then, the perpetual agony dropped. One moment you were clinging to the rail, the next the deck fell away beneath you as the ship plunged into a trough between waves. Your knees buckled, your grip slipped. You landed hard on the sodden planks, rolling like a barrel as the ship heaved upward again, the bow rising so sharply you half expected it to keep going until you were vertical. A hand grabbed your collar, holding you upright with surprising strength. The cook, his face streaming with rain, shoved you toward the mainmast. "Tee yourself to something, idiot," he bellowed over the wind. "Unless you fancy swimming." You didn't argue. The mast was slick with seawater, the ropes cutting into your palms as you lashed yourself to it with clumsy knots. Around you the crew moved with practiced urgency, their shouts barely audible over the storm's fury. The captain stood at the helm, his beard whipping in the gale, bellowing orders that were more instinct than instruction at this point. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos in stark flashes. Men scrambled up rigging that swung wildly with each roll of the ship. Barrels broke free of their lashings, tumbling across the deck like dice thrown by a drunken god. Somewhere in the din, Admiral Whiskers yowled his displeasure before vanishing below decks with feline good sense. You stayed where you were, too nauseated to move, too terrified to close your eyes. The waves towered over the ship, each one a mountain of black water that seemed poised to crush you flat. And yet, despite the terror, despite the way your heart hammered against your ribs like a prisoner begging for release, your stomach was oddly calm. It made no sense. The storm was worse than anything you'd endured so far. The ship bucking like a spooked horse, the world reduced to heaving chaos. And yet for the first time since setting sail you were seasick. The realization would have been funny if it hadn't been so cruel. A scream cut through the wind. You turned just in time to see Briggs lose his footing as a wave crashed over the starboard side. He slid across the deck, grabbing desperately at ropes that slithered through his fingers like live snakes. Then he was gone, swallowed by the railing in a tangle of limbs and panic. The carpenter lunged, catching Briggs' wrist at the last possible second. For a heartbeat, they hung there, suspended between ship and sea. Then the next wave hit, and both men vanished over the side. No one had time to react. No cries of man overboard. No futile toss of lifeline. The storm had claimed 2 souls in an instant, and the yet perpetual agony raced on without them, helpless against the wind's will. The cook appeared beside you, his face grim. "Hold tight," he shouted. "This ain't the worst of it." He was right. The next hour passed in a blur of noise and motion, the storm reaching new heights of violence. Sails tore free with sounds like cannon fire. The ship's timbers groaned like dying things. At some point, the maintopmast snapped, crashing down in a tangle of rope and canvas that nearly took the first mate with it. Through it all, you clung to your rope, your nausea replaced by a dazed sort of clarity. This was how it ended then. Not with gold or glory, not with a heroic last stand. Just a wet, inglorious death in the belly of a storm that didn't even have the decency to make you seasick first. The thought might have been funny if you hadn't been so scared. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm broke. The wind died first, its howls fading to whimpers. The waves, though still towering, lost their murderous edge, their crests no longer frothing with quite the same fury. The rain thinned to a drizzle, then stopped entirely, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely quiet. The crew moved like sleepwalkers, assessing damage with hollow eyes. 2 men gone. Theirs in tatters. The mast, a splintered ruin. But the ship still floated, and that, it seemed, was enough for now. The captain appeared at your side, his face unreadable. "Still with us, then?" You nodded, your voice lost somewhere between exhaustion and shock. He studied you for a long moment, then surprised you by chuckling. "Because the one time we could have used your seasickness, it deserts you." You stared at him. Billingsley clapped you on the shoulder, his grip firm. "Next storm, try puking earlier. Might scare the wind right out of the sails." Then he was gone, bellowing orders to the survivors, his laughter trailing behind him like a challenge to the sea itself. You untied yourself from the mast, your legs trembling. The deck was a wreck, the air thick with the smell of salt and splintered wood. Somewhere in the distance, a lone seabird cried, but when you looked up, there was nothing there. The storm had passed. You weren't sure whether to be relieved or disappointed. Chapter 11. The surgeon's grim diagnosis. The morning after the storm dawned brittle and too bright, the sun glinting off the wreckage strewn across the deck like a mocking reminder that the world carried on regardless of who drowned in it. You ached in places you hadn't known could ache, your fingers stiff from hours of clinging to ropes, your ribs bruised from being thrown against the mast, your stomach hollowed out from fear rather than nausea for once. That last part, at least, was a novelty. The cook found you slumped against a barrel, picking at a strip of salt pork he'd pressed into your hand with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Surgeon wants to see you," he said. You blinked up at him. "Why?" He shrugged. "Captain's orders. Says if you're going to keep being useless, least we can do is make sure you're not dying while you're at it." The ship's surgeon, if he could be called that, had set up his makeshift infirmary in the one dry corner of the lower deck, between a leaking barrel of pickled herring and a stack of moldering sailcloth. He was a gaunt man with the stained fingers of an inveterate pipe smoker and the unsettling cheer of someone who enjoyed his work a little too much. "Ah, our resident landlubber," he declared as you shuffled in. "Come to grace me with your fascinating symptoms, have you?" You sat on the crate he indicated, trying not to breathe too deeply of the mingled sense of brine, blood, and whatever unidentifiable tinctures bubbled in the vials at his elbow. "I'm not sick," you said. "Just Bad at sailing. The surgeon grinned, revealing teeth like weathered tombstones. That's what they all say. He seized your wrist, pressing bony fingers to your pulse with surprising force. Let's see, shall we? Eyes first. The examination that followed was less a medical assessment and more a series of vaguely threatening prods. He peered into your ears with a lens that smelled of sulfur, thumped your chest until you coughed, and made you stick out your tongue so he could squint at it like a man deciphering a poorly written map. He said at last, leaning back. Fascinating. You wiped your tongue on your sleeve. What is? You, he said, are a marvel of modern medicine. I've seen men succumb to scurvy with more fortitude than you display at the slightest swell. Your humors are clearly unbalanced, your constitution is frankly pathetic, and your liver, here he poked you sharply in the side, making you yell, is clearly in open rebellion against the very concept of maritime travel. You rubbed your ribs. So what does that mean? He sighed, as if explaining to a particularly slow child. It means, my seasick friend, that you are constitutionally unsuited for the sea. Some men are born to it, some learn to tolerate it, and some, he gestured grandly at you, are better off as farmers. You stared at him. That's it? That's your diagnosis? Would you prefer I bleed you? He brandished a rusty lancet with alarming enthusiasm. You declined. The surgeon shrugged and tucked the blade away. Thought not. No, I'm afraid your ailment is both incurable and entirely predictable. The sea doesn't agree with you. The solution is simple. Go ashore. Precisely. He leaned in, his breath a warm gust of cloves and decay. Of course, given our current position, which is to say, the middle of the gods-forsaken ocean, that might prove tricky. So until we make landfall, my prescription is this. Try not to die. It's terribly inconvenient for the rest of us. You left his infirmary feeling no better informed than when you'd entered, save for a new appreciation for the relative safety of dry land, wherever that might. The cook was waiting outside, leaning against the bulkhead with his arms crossed. Well, he asked. You sighed. Here's as I'm terrible at being a sailor. The cook snorted. Took him this long to figure that out. Together you climbed back to the deck, where the crew was still picking through the storm's wreckage. The carpenter's absence was a palpable thing. No gruff commentary on the state of the ship, no dry observations about the weather. Just a space where he should have been, as telling as any hole in the hull. The captain stood near the helm, surveying the damage with a critical eye. He noticed your approach and nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or simple resignation. Surgeon give you a clean bill of health, he asked. You thought of the man's verdict. Constitutionally unsuited, more or less. Billingsley grunted. Good. Because we've got a long way yet to go, and I'll be damned if I let the sea have you before we get there. It wasn't exactly a vote of confidence. But as the crew worked around you, patching sails and splicing ropes, you found yourself oddly comforted. You might be the worst sailor aboard the IP Perpetual Agony, but at least you were still aboard. Chapter 12. The Dream of Solid Ground. The fever came on quietly, slinking into your bones like a thief in the night. At first you thought it was just exhaustion, the storm, the surgeon's prodding, the constant sway of the ship all blending into a general misery. But by evening, your skin burned where it touched the rough wool of your hammock, and the world took on a soft, wavering quality as if seen through old glass. The cook noticed first, pressing the back of his hand to your forehead as you listlessly pushed away another offering of hardtack. Hell's teeth, he muttered. You're burning up. You wanted to argue, but your tongue felt too thick, your thoughts slow and syrupy. The cook's face swam above you, his usual scowl blurred at the edges. His voice came from very far away when he said, Don't die on me, lad. I'm not digging your grave. Then the dreams came. You stood on solid ground, real, unmoving, glorious ground. Grass cushioned your bare feet, cool and springy. Trees towered overhead, their leaves whispering in a breeze that carried no salt, no stink of fish and tar. Somewhere nearby, water burbled in a stream, clear and sweet, nothing like the brackish ship's water that always carried the faint taste of wood rot. You knelt, pressing your palms to the earth, feeling its steadiness seep into you. No rocking, no pitching, just perfect, beautiful stillness. A shadow fell across you. The seagull, that damned, judgmental seagull, perched on a rock nearby, its head cocked. "This isn't real," you said. The gull blinked. You woke to the ship's familiar groan, the hammock swaying beneath you in time with the waves. For one blissful moment you'd forgotten where you were. Then reality crashed back, and with it, the fever's heat, the sour taste in your mouth, the ache in every joint. The cook was there, pressing a lukewarm rag to your forehead. "Back with us?" You tried to speak, but your throat was raw. The cook took pity and held a mug to your lips. The water inside tasted faintly of ginger and something bitter. "Surgeon's orders," he said. "Says you've got a touch of ship's fever, probably from clinging to that mast like a barnacle during the storm." You managed a weak glare. The cook shrugged. "Drink it or don't. Makes no difference to me if you hallucinate yourself to death." You drank. The bitterness clung to your teeth, but within minutes the world stopped its gentle spinning. The cook watched you with something almost like approval. "Captain wants to know if you'll live," he said. You rasped, "Tell him. I'll try not to inconvenience him with my death." The cook barked a laugh. "I'll pass that along." As he turned to go, you grabbed his sleeve. "The land," you said. In my dream, it felt so real. Something flickered in the cook's eyes, understanding maybe, or pity. "Aye," he said quietly. "It always does." He left you then, to the sway of the hammock and the creak of the ship and the distant cry of gulls that may or may not have been real. The fever dragged you back under, and this time you dreamed of nothing at all. When you woke again, it was to gray dawn light filtering through the deck boards above. Your head was clearer, though your body felt wrung out like a rag. The ship still moved beneath you, but the motion was gentler now, the seas calmer. The cook appeared with more broth, this time without the bitter aftertaste. "We're making for port," he said. 2 days out if the wind holds. Port Bedtime, on the twilight, there. Solid, unmoving ground. You barely dared to hope. Where? Some pissant island even the map-makers forgot, but it's got fresh water and a tavern, and that's enough for me. He studied you. You'll be first off, I wager. You closed your eyes, imagining it, the dock beneath your feet, the earth staying blessedly still. No more heaving decks. No more retching over rails. The cook's next words shattered the fantasy. "Course, we'll be sailing again soon as we're resupplied." Your eyes flew open. He grinned, showing crooked teeth. "Don't look so horrified. Maybe you'll get your sea legs yet." You groaned and pulled the thin blanket over your head. The cook's laughter followed you back into sleep, where no dreams of land came to taunt you this time. Just the endless, rocking dark. Chapter 13. The cabin boy's sympathy. The fever broke by mid-morning, leaving you hollowed out and shaky, but mercifully clear-headed. The ship still swayed beneath you. That at least had not been a fever dream. But the motion seemed gentler today, as if the sea itself had tired of tormenting you. You emerged onto deck, squinting against the sunlight. Your legs unsteady but holding. The crew gave you a wide berth, their glances a mix of wariness and pity. All except for the cabin boy, a scrawny scrap of humanity named Pip, who couldn't have been more than 12, and who had until now wisely avoided you. He cornered you near the water barrel, his eyes darting around like a nervous rabbit's before he thrust something into your hands. "Here," he muttered, before anyone sees. It was a biscuit, not ship's hardtack, but a proper, if slightly stale, biscuit with a faint dusting of sugar still clinging to its edges. A treasure aboard this floating prison. You stared at it, then at Pip. Where did you— Doesn't matter, he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. Just eat it quick, and don't tell the cook. You should have been suspicious. You should have questioned why the cabin boy, who had every reason to hoard such a prize, would risk sharing it with you, of all people. But hunger overrode caution, and you took a bite. The biscuit was dry and crumbly, but to your salt-ravaged tongue it might as well have been ambrosia. You nearly groaned with relief as the sugar hit your tongue, sweet and fleeting. Then the ship lurched. It wasn't even a proper wave, just a rogue swell, the kind that normally wouldn't have fazed you. But your stomach, already unsettled from the fever and unused to real food, rebelled with shocking violence. You barely had time to shove Pip aside before you were at the railing, the precious biscuit, along with what felt like the last of your dignity, disappearing into the churning water below. Pip watched the proceedings with wide eyes. That, he said slowly, was my best biscuit. You wiped your mouth, your face burning with more than fever. I'm sorry. He sighed, the long-suffering sigh of a child who has seen too much. It's all right. I figured you'd puke it up anyway. You blinked. Then why give it to me? Pip shrugged, scuffing his bare foot against the deck. Dunno, maybe 'cause no one else does. He glanced around again, then leaned in conspiratorially. Besides, I've got 3 more hidden in my bunk. The confession startled a laugh out of you, which turned into a cough, which nearly turned into another trip to the railing. Pip thumped you on the back with surprising force for someone so small. You're really bad at this, he observed. Sailing? And eben Sinai. Und es soll sein, haben die Bibel dabei. You couldn't argue. Pip lingered a while longer, sharing gossip gleaned from his eavesdropping, the first mate's secret fondness for knitting, the surgeon's questionable experiments with squid ink as a tonic, the cook's hidden stash of real tea leaves. It was mindless chatter, the kind that required no response, and you found yourself oddly grateful for it. Eventually, duty called him away, leaving you alone with your thoughts and the lingering taste of bile. The biscuit had been a kindness, small and pointless as it was. The first real kindness anyone aboard had shown you since the cook took pity on your seasickness. The thought should have comforted you. Instead, it settled like a stone in your gut. Because kindness aboard a ship like this was a currency as rare as fresh fruit, and you couldn't shake the feeling that Pip had just wasted his on a lost cause. You were still mulling that over when the cry came from the crow's nest. Land ho! This time, it was real. Chapter 14. The Navigator's Dry Humor. The Promised Land turned out to be little more than a smudge on the horizon. A narrow crescent of sand and scrubby vegetation that wouldn't have merited a second glance under normal circumstances. But after weeks at sea, it might as well have been paradise. You stood at the bow, your fingers gripping the rail as if you could pull the island closer through sheer force of will. The breeze carried unfamiliar scents, earth, greenery, something sweet you couldn't name. Your stomach, normally treacherous, remained still for once, too preoccupied with anticipation to revolt. The navigator appeared beside you, his weathered face impassive as he checked his instruments against the approaching shoreline. 2 hours, he said, more to himself than to you. Then, noticing your rapt attention, he added, assuming we don't run aground on the reefs. You swallowed. Are there reefs? He shrugged. There's always reefs. The ship inched closer, the details of the island coming into focus, palm trees leaning drunkenly toward the water, a strip of white sand, a darker smudge that might have been a settlement or just a trick of the light. A particularly gentle wave rocked the ship, and despite yourself, you swayed with it, your stomach giving a warning lurch. The navigator watched your paling face with detached interest. If you're this sick on calm seas, he observed, You'd better pray you never see a real tempest. You opened your mouth to respond, but the ship chose that moment to hit a swell, and your reply turned into a strangled gulp. The navigator sighed and handed you a bucket. Here, try not to hit the deck. You accepted the bucket with as much dignity as you could muster, which wasn't much. The navigator returned to his charts, seemingly unbothered by your distress. Between heaves you managed to ask, "How long? Until we dock?" He didn't look up. "Depends." "On what?" "On whether you puke on my shoes." You clutched the bucket tighter. As the island grew nearer, the crew's activity increased. Sails were adjusted, ropes coiled, the anchor made ready. The cook emerged from the galley, squinting at the shoreline like a man assessing a dubious cut of meat. Even Admiral Whiskers deigned to appear, his single eye fixed on the approaching land with feline calculation. The captain bellowed orders from the quarterdeck, his voice carrying over the creak of timbers and the slap of waves. The navigator called out depth readings, his dry monotone never varying even as the water shallowed beneath the keel. And you? You clung to your bucket and your dignity in equal measure, trying not to think about how absurd it was to be seasick within spitting distance of land. The navigator paused in his readings long enough to glance at you. "You might want to brace yourself," he said. You groaned. "Another storm?" "No, but the landing's going to be rough." He nodded toward the shore, where the gentle waves were breaking against a jagged line of rocks. "Captain's not one for finesse." As if on cue, the ship jerked violently, the hull scraping against something underwater with a sound that set your teeth on edge. A chorus of shouts went up from the crew as the ship shuddered to a stop, tilted slightly to starboard. You, the bucket, and its contents went sliding across the deck in a graceless tangle. The navigator stepped neatly aside, watching your progress with what might have been amusement. "Told you." You came to rest against the base of the mast, the bucket miraculously still upright in your hands. Around you, the crew sprang into action, lowering boats and shouting about tides and damage assessments. The captain's voice boomed over the chaos. "All ashore, who's going ashore?" You looked at the navigator. He looked at you. "Well," he said, "what are you waiting for? A written invitation?" You stood on trembling legs, clutching the empty bucket like a lifeline. Land was right there. Solid, unmoving, glorious land. All you had to do was reach it. The navigator nodded toward the rope ladder that had been thrown over the side. "Try not to fall. Sharks love a clumsy meal." You took a deep breath and moved toward the rail, trying to ignore the way the deck still seemed to sway beneath your feet. "Behind you," the navigator added, "and if you do make it, stay there." You didn't need to be told twice. Chapter 15. The first glimpse of land. The island grew larger on the horizon, its jagged silhouette softening into recognizable shapes. Ponds leaning toward the sea, white sand beaches, a smudge of green that hinted at vegetation thicker than the usual scrub. After weeks of nothing but endless water in every direction, the sight should have filled you with uncomplicated joy. Instead, your stomach twisted in a way that had nothing to do with seasickness. Because making landfall meant two things. First, you would finally set foot on solid ground again. A prospect so glorious it made your knees weak just thinking about it. Second, the crew would have fresh ammunition for mockery that would likely follow you to your grave. You could already hear their jabs. Look who finally stopped puking long enough to walk. Yea, and ye careful, the ground might move. And, worst of all, we think you can manage a whole hour without hugging a bucket? Oxum, the cook appeared at your shoulder, squinting at the approaching shoreline. "Try not to kiss the dirt when we land," he muttered. "They'll never let you forget it." You groaned. "Too late. They're never going to let me forget any of this." The cook shrugged. Probably not, but look on the bright side. There's a bright side? Sure. He scratched his chin. If you're lucky, they'll name the tavern after you. Sicilian sailor has a nice ring to it. You buried your face in your hands. Around you, the crew worked with unusual efficiency, spurred on by the promise of fresh food and even fresher gossip. Sails were furled, ropes coiled, and the longboat prepared for launch. The captain stood at the helm, his usual scowl softened by what might have been anticipation or indigestion. It was hard to tell with bloody Billingsley. Pip, the cabin boy, darted past you, his arms full of supplies for the shore party. He paused long enough to grin up at you. You gonna faint when you step on land? My money's on yes. You swiped at him half-heartedly. I hate all of you. Pip's laughter followed him as he scampered away. The ship eased closer to shore, the water shifting from deep blue to turquoise to a clear, shallow green. Fish darted beneath the surface, visible even from the deck. The air smelled different here, earthier, with hints of vegetation and damp soil, instead of endless salt and tar. Your legs trembled with something that wasn't nausea for once. Anticipation. Dread. The sheer overwhelming need to feel something beneath your feet that didn't move. The navigator called out depths as the ship crept toward anchor point. The captain barked orders. The crew moved with practiced ease, all except for you, who stood frozen at the rail, caught between desperate longing and creeping anxiety. What if land felt strange now? What if your legs had forgotten how to walk on anything but shifting decks? What if... The anchor dropped with a splash and a rattle of chain. The ship settled, the gentle rock of the waves somehow different at rest than in motion. The captain surveyed the shore, then turned his gaze on you. Well, he said, you've been dreaming of this for weeks. Get in the damn boat. The crew's laughter followed you as you clambered into the longboat, their jokes and jabs bouncing off your back like so much spray. None of it mattered. Because ahead of you, impossibly close now, lay solid ground. And for the first time since you'd signed that damned contract, you thought you might survive this after all. Chapter 16. The crew's farewell jests. The moment your boots touched solid ground, a great shuddering sigh escaped you. The earth beneath your feet remained gloriously, miraculously still. No rocking, no pitching, just blessed stability. You wanted to fall to your knees and kiss the dirt, but the cook's warning kept you upright through sheer force of pride. Behind you, the crew made no such effort at dignity. A chorus of exaggerated retching sounds erupted from the longboat, each man trying to outdo the others in volume and dramatic flair. The carpenter clutched his stomach with one hand, and the railing with the other, making noises like a dying walrus. The navigator pretended to vomit over the side with such enthusiasm, he nearly toppled in. Even Admiral Whiskers got in on the act, hacking up a hairball at your feet with perfect comic timing. Pip, the little traitor, had tears streaming down his face from laughter as he mimed your seasick stagger across the beach. Oh gods, he wailed between giggles. The land, it's moving. Someone hold me. You stood there, your face burning, as the entire crew of the E-Aim's perpetual agony commemorated your misery in a symphony of mockery. The sounds carried across the quiet harbor, drawing curious looks from fishermen and dockworkers. Your shame would be legend before sundown. The captain was the last to disembark, stepping onto the dock with his usual swagger. He surveyed the scene, his crew in hysterics, you standing stiff with embarrassment, and nodded solemnly. A fitting tribute, he declared. Then, with perfect deadpan delivery, he added, we'll name the next ship after you. Yes. Having eyes. Whoa. That nearly sank the longboat, as the men doubled over in fresh gales of laughter. You briefly considered throwing yourself into the harbor. Only the cook showed any mercy, clapping you on the shoulder as he passed. "Cheer up," he muttered. "This is how you know they liked you." You stared at him. He shrugged. "They only torment the ones they drink with." Then, after a pause, "Well, maybe not drinking with in your case, but certainly point and laugh at." The crew's antics continued as they unloaded cargo, each man finding new ways to incorporate retching sounds into his work. Barrels were rolled with dramatic groans. Ropes were coiled with accompanying gagging noises. Even the simple act of tying a knot became an opportunity for exaggerated stomach clutching. By midday, the entire waterfront had taken up the joke. Doc Hance, you'd never met, paused to mimic vomiting as you passed. A fishmonger's wife offered you a bucket just in case. A group of children followed you through the streets, making noises like a ship in a squall. You took refuge in the first tavern you found, slumping at a corner table with your face in your hands. The barman, a grizzled old salt with one milky eye, took one look at you and slid a tankard across the scarred wood. "Heard about you," he said. "That'll be double." You groaned. "Why double?" He grinned, revealing 3 remaining teeth. "Hazard pay, in case you ruin my floor." You drank in sullen silence as the tavern filled with sailors from other ships, each new arrival greeted with fresh retching impressions from your former crewmate. The story was growing with each retelling. Apparently you'd once been so seasick you vomited over the side and startled a passing whale. Night fell, and with it came the realization that you were free. No more watches, no more heaving decks, no more relentless teasing. Well, perhaps slightly less relentless teasing. You could find work ashore, maybe even a room that didn't sway in the breeze. As you stood to leave, a familiar voice called out from the tavern door. "Leaving so soon?" The cook stood there, a bundle under one arm. He tossed it onto your table with a thud. Your sea chest, the sum total of your worldly possessions aboard the Yapi Perpetual Agane. "You're really staying then," he said. You nodded. He considered this, then jerked his head toward the bar, where the rest of the crew was busy drinking away their pay. "They'll miss you, you know. A good puking companion is hard to find." You snorted. "I doubt that." The cook shrugged. "Suit yourself." He turned to go, then paused. "Oh, almost forgot." He dug in his pocket and produced a small grease-stained packet. "From Pip Diet." Inside was a single, slightly crushed biscuit, the same kind he'd shared with you before, the one you'd immediately lost overboard. You looked up, but the cook was already walking away, leaving you alone with your thoughts and the fading sounds of exaggerated retching from the bar. Somewhere out in the harbor, the Eames Perpetual Agony rode at anchor, ready to sail again at dawn. Without you. You took a bite of the biscuit. It was dry. It was stale. It stayed down. And that, you decided as you stepped out into the quiet night, was victory enough. Chapter 17. The Walk of Shame. The morning sun burned far too brightly for your taste as you staggered down the waterfront, legs trembling like a newborn foal's. Weeks at sea had stolen your land legs completely, and now every step sent conflicting signals to your bewildered muscles. The ground felt unnaturally still beneath your feet, yet your body swayed instinctively as if still braced against phantom waves. A fishwife paused in gutting her catch to stare openly at your progress. 2 old sailors sharing a pipe on a bench nudged each other and smirked. Children playing with a wooden hoop stopped to point and giggle as you lurched past. You knew what they saw. A pale, sunken-cheeked wreck of a man, hair matted with salt, clothes hanging loose from weeks of lost meals, walking with the cautious horror of someone who expected the very stones to heave beneath him at any moment. "Land sickness," cackled one of the old sailors. "Ain't seen a case that bad since old One-Eyed Pete came ashore after 3 years whaling." You opened your mouth to retort, but the simple act of stopping your forward momentum proved disastrous. Your knees buckled. The world tilted alarmingly. Only a desperate grab at a nearby hitching post saved you from collapsing face first into the street. This sent the children into fresh gales of laughter. One particularly bold boy mimed your staggering walk while making exaggerated gagging noises. His friends cheered him on. The tavern door across the street seemed impossibly far away, but it represented sanctuary, or at least the possibility of ale to dull the humiliation. You focused on it like a dying man spotting an oasis, willing your rebellious legs to cooperate. Step by agonizing step, you inched forward, trailing a growing audience of amused onlookers. Halfway there, your stomach gave a treacherous lurch. You froze, sweat breaking out on your brow, as you desperately willed your body not to betray you further. The crowd held its collective breath in anticipation. Then, miraculously, the moment passed. A ragged cheer went up from your impromptu audience. Someone tossed a copper coin at your feet. "Bravo!" called the fishwife, wiping her hands on her apron. "Now try not to ruin my clean street." You reached the tavern door like a shipwrecked survivor grasping a lifeline. As you pulled it open, the cook's voice rang out from somewhere behind you. "Don't worry, lads. He'll find his land legs just in time to board the next ship." The resulting laughter followed you inside, where you collapsed onto the first available bench and buried your face in your hands. The barman, a different one than last night, but wearing the same expression of amused pity, slid a tankard in your direction. "Rum," he said, "full of the walking dead." You drank deeply, barely tasting the burn as it slid down your throat. Outside, the sounds of the bustling port continued, your audience gradually dispersing now that the show was over. Somewhere out there, the Ye Perpetual Agony rode at anchor, its crew no doubt already regaling the town with tales of the worst sailor ever to disgrace the seven seas. But here, in this dim corner, with a drink in your hand and solid unmoving earth beneath your feet, none of that mattered. You were free. The rum helped too. Chapter 18. The Tavern's Harsh Welcome. The rum burned a welcome path to your stomach, its warmth spreading through your limbs like a comforting lie. For a few blissful moments you almost forgot the humiliation of your waterfront stagger, the mocking laughter of children, the way even stray dogs had seemed to smirk at your unsteady progress. Then the kitchen door swung open, releasing a cloud of steam laden with the unmistakable stench of fish stew. Your throat clenched. Your stomach performed a slow, sickening roll. The rum surged back up your gullet with alarming speed, stopping just short of disaster through sheer force of will. You swallowed convulsively, breaking out in a cold sweat as your fingers tightened around the tankard like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. The barman watched your struggle with professional detachment. "Want another?" he asked, nodding at your now empty mug. You managed a shaky nod, not trusting your voice. He refilled it with practiced ease, then leaned on the counter. "You're that sailor, ain't you? The one what couldn't keep his breakfast down." You closed your eyes. "Does everyone know?" "Course." He chuckled, wiping a glass with a rag that might have been clean last week. "Port towns live for two things, fresh ships and fresh gossip. You're both." The second rum went down easier, though your stomach still twitched in protest. Around you, the tavern slowly filled with the evening crowd, fishermen smelling of salt and sweat, merchants arguing over prices, a few off-duty sailors who took one look at you and immediately started whispering behind their hands. A serving girl appeared at your elbow, her tray laden with bowls of that damned stew. The smell hit you like a physical blow, fish oil and onions and something unidentifiable that made your salivary glands clench in horror. "Stew?" she asked cheerfully. You gagged. She took a step back, expertly balancing her tray as your face turned an impressive shade of green. Or not. You pressed a hand to your mouth and shook your head violently. To her credit, she didn't laugh, just nodded in solemn understanding, and moved on to less precarious customers. The barman, however, let out a loud guffaw that drew every eye in the place. "That's it, lads," he announced to the room. "We found the one man who can't stomach Maggie's famous stew, and after months at sea no less." The resulting uproar was immediate and merciless. Jokes flew thicker than flies around a midden. Someone started a betting pool on how long you'd last before bolting for the door. A grizzled old whaleman claimed he'd seen men puke from the smell before, but never just from seeing the bowl. You hunched over your drink, wishing the floor would open up and swallow you. The irony wasn't lost on you. After weeks of seasickness, you'd finally reached land only to be undone by fish stew. The barman took pity eventually, sliding a crust of bread across the counter. "Here," he muttered. "Soak up some of that rum before you pass out." You nibbled at it cautiously, relieved when it stayed down. The tavern's attention had mercifully shifted to a drunken card game in the corner, though you still caught the occasional glance and smirk in your direction. As night deepened, the crowd thinned. The lanterns burned low, casting wavering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. You sat in your corner, nursing your fourth, or was it fifth, drink, the bread a soggy lump in your stomach. The kitchen door swung open again, but this time only the cook emerged, a different cook than the one aboard the I Perpetual Agony, but wearing the same world-weary expression. He carried a steaming mug that he placed before you without ceremony. "Ginger tea," he grunted. "Won't cure stupid, but it'll settle your guts." You looked up, surprised. He shrugged. "Seen it before. Men forget how to eat proper after too long at sea." Then, with a glance at the empty rum mugs, though most don't try to solve the problem with liquor. The tea was bitter and strong, but within minutes the constant churning in your stomach began to ease. You sipped it slowly, watching as the last patrons staggered out into the night. The barman started extinguishing lanterns. "You got a place to stay?" You shook your head. He sighed. "There's a cot in the back. 2 coppers extra." You paid without argument, too exhausted to care about the inflated price. The cot was little more than a sack of straw with a moth-eaten blanket, but it was horizontal and didn't move. As you lay there in the dark, listening to the tavern's nocturnal creaks and the distant lap of waves, a traitorous thought crept in. You missed the ship. Not the vomiting, not the humiliation, but the rhythm of life at sea, the camaraderie of shared suffering, even the cook's dubious remedies. Your stomach gurgled ominously at the memory. On the other hand, solid ground had its charms. You closed your eyes, the ginger tea warming your belly, and slept dreamlessly for the first time in months. Chapter 19. The Decision to Never Sail Again. Morning light crept through the tavern's grimy windows, painting stripes of gold across the rough floorboards. You lay perfectly still on your rented cot, eyes closed, taking silent inventory of your body. No rolling waves, no pitching decks, just the blessed unmoving solidity of dry land beneath you. And yet, your stomach gave a faint, treacherous lurch at the memory of yesterday's fish stew incident. That settled it. You sat up with sudden conviction, straw poking through the thin blanket. Never again. No more ships. No more waves. No more buckets. You would find work here. Work that involved staying very, very still on very, very dry land. The tavern keeper was already bustling about when you emerged, wiping down tables with a rag that had seen better decades. He took one look at your determined expression and sighed. "Need work, do you?" You nodded. "Can you chop wood?" With enthusiasm. He chuckled. "Well then, woodshed's out back. Breakfast first, though." He gestured to a pot bubbling over the hearth. You eyed it warily. "Porridge," he clarified. "Nothing fancy." The porridge was bland and lumpy, but it stayed down, a small victory you celebrated with cautious relief. The woodshed, as promised, stood behind the tavern, its axe leaning against the doorframe like an old friend. You set to work with a will, the repetitive motion of splitting logs strangely soothing. Each thunk of the axe, each clean break of wood, grounded you further in the earth's steady embrace. No rolling here, no pitching, just solid ground and honest labor. By midday, a respectable pile of firewood stood stacked against the tavern wall, and your palms bore the beginnings of blisters. The tavern keeper emerged with a mug of small beer, surveying your work with grudging approval. "Not bad," he allowed. "You're hired, if you want it." You did. The afternoon passed in a haze of sweat and splinters, the rhythm of work driving all thought of ships from your mind. No more storms, no more seasickness. Just this simple, stationary toil. As dusk fell, you sat on the tavern's back step, nursing another mug of beer and flexing your sore hands. The cook, the real cook, not the tavern keeper, appeared beside you, puffing on a pipe that smelled of cherries and regret. "So," he said, blowing a smoke ring into the still air, "you're staying." You nodded. He studied you for a long moment, then shrugged. "Smart choice." Another puff. "Dumb profession, but smart choice." You couldn't argue. Night settled over the port, the stars emerging one by one. Somewhere out beyond the harbor mouth, the perpetual Agani might still be at anchor, or perhaps already sailing for distant shores. Either way, it no longer mattered. You had found your land legs at last. The tavern door creaked open behind you, spilling lamplight across the step. "Supper's ready," called the keeper. "And don't worry, it's not fish." You stood dusting wood chips from your trousers and went inside. The floor beneath your feet remained blessedly, wonderfully still. And that, you decided as you sat down to your first proper meal in months, was all that mattered. Chapter 20. The Legend That Follows You. The years passed like the turning of pages in a well-worn logbook. The tavern became your home, its walls absorbing your sweat, your stories, and eventually your ownership, when the old keeper passed the keys to you with a wheezing laugh and a slap on the back. You grew accustomed to the rhythm of life on land, the changing seasons, the tides of travelers, the comforting predictability of floors that never moved beneath your feet. And yet, the sea never truly left you. It came back in the way the fishermen would glance at you before ordering, their eyes flicking to your hands as if expecting them to shake. It lived in the knowing smirks of old salts who passed through, whispering to their companions before bursting into laughter. It lingered in the way the local children would dare each other to ask you about your time aboard the perpetual agony, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. You ignored it all, pouring drinks and chopping wood, steadfast in your refusal to acknowledge the legend that had somehow outrun you. Then, one evening, a familiar face darkened the doorway. The cook, older now, his hair streaked with gray but his scowl just as potent, strode in as if he'd never left. He dropped onto a stool at the bar with a grunt, eyeing the tap with the critical stare of a man who had suffered much bad ale in his time. You slid a mug in front of him without a word. He took a long drink, wiped his mouth, and said, "Heard you own this place now." You nodded. "Good for you." He took another swig. "Though I'd have thought you'd pick a trade farther from the water." You shrugged. "Habit." The cook chuckled, and for a moment it was as if no time had passed at all. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know they still talk about you, right?" You groaned. "Oh, aye," he continued, grinning. "Every new batch of greenhorns gets the tale. The sailor who got seasick on the first day and never recovered. Some say you puked so hard you scared off a storm. Others claim you were cursed by a mermaid." He shook his head. "Pip, remember Pip? He swears you once vomited so violently it created its own tide. You buried your face in your hands. I hate all of you." The cook laughed, loud and booming, drawing the attention of the other patrons. "Ah, but you're part of the ship's lore now, forever immortalized as the worst sailor to ever disgrace the deck." He raised his mug in salute. A legacy, my friend. You poured yourself a drink and clinked it against his. A legacy of shame. Better than no legacy at all. The night wore on, the tavern filling with laughter and smoke. The cook told stories of the crew, who had retired, who had been lost, who still sailed, and who had settled. And though you didn't ask, you listened, your fingers tracing the familiar wood grain of the bar beneath them. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The cook stood, stretching his back with a groan. Back to the ship at dawn, he said. You nodded. Try not to sink. He smirked. Try not to puke. And with that he was gone, disappearing into the night as if he'd never been there at all. You locked up the tavern, stepping outside to breathe in the salt-tinged air. Somewhere out beyond the harbor, the perpetual agony, or whatever ship the cook now haunted, rode the waves, carrying its stories, its legends, its foolish tales of the worst sailor to ever sail. You shook your head and smiled. Then you turned and walked inside, the door clicking shut behind you. The floor, as always, remained perfectly, blessedly still.